Hello and welcome to my presentation. I'll be talking about fostering motivation, interest and self-efficacy in STEM. And I conducted a study about the effects on youth's experiences with STEM learning stations. This is an asynchronous presentation, so I'm not sure I'll be able to take questions. However, please feel free to contact me. My name is Myriam de Vivier. I am sitting in Vienna right now. I got a background in inclusive pedagogy and mental health in education. I do a lot of qualitative research and I am right now trying to write my dissertation. If you want to read more about me, please just stop the video now. I'll be waiting and continue when you are done. The study I conducted was part of a project, which I will outline to you now. It was called in German MINT-Region Burgenland, which would translate as STEM region Burgenland. And to describe this a bit better, let me show you where Burgenland is in Austria. So first, let me show you a map of Austria. Here it is. And the red region you see here is Burgenland. It's one of the 9 federal states of Austria. And it's known for its industrial enterprises. However, besides that, it is a rather rural area. So the focus is put on industry to maintain the regional growth. In line with the Burgenland's focus on industry, they want to spark young people's interest in STEM at a very young age. So they try to be innovative with the STEM education, which brought this project to life. So this project comprises the innovation of 6 different learning stations where young pupils can learn about STEM. They are mobile and can be used in different schools. And all of them are supposed to spark interest, heighten motivation, and self-efficacy in STEM. I will explain the stations and the research in a bit, but first let me introduce you to the project partners. So the project partners are firstly Ovos Media. They have an app series that accompanies many educational purposes. Secondly, the Burgenländische Schulungszentrum, I will call it BUTZ. It's an educational provider in the Burgenland. And thirdly, the University of Vienna, the Center for Teacher Education to be specific, and I work in the subgroup Digital Education and Learning. And the research part of the whole project was funded by the FFG. So for this project, Ovos Media created an app that accompanies the learning stations. I will show you the app later. And the Burgenländische Schulungszentrum are the organizers who came up with the stations and who also administer the stations and their distribution in school. All in all, there was a total of 6 learning stations. I'll introduce them to you now. So the first one is robotics. Robotics has a little dash robot and it is programmed by a blocky app. The robot has to be programmed to absolve a little parkour you can see in the tiny picture here. The second station is called control technology, and here there is a robot arm, like an automated arm, that you have to program, and then you have to move around tokens and dice. It has a tablet to control the arm, and you move the materials according to a set of tasks. The third station is an AI station, where the participants have to experiment with prompts and generate images with the DALL-E AI. The fourth station is called electromobility, and participants can operate a drone here. And they have to firstly connect the drone with the remote control and then fly back and forth between 2 landing pads. One of them can be seen here in the picture. The fifth and the 6th station both are experiments with energy. The first one is the candy grabber, where you manually power a candy grabber machine and one person generates energy with the crane and the other one plays and tries to grab as many candies or treats as possible. The other one is a measurement station where a crank is used to manually generate energy, and also a current meter is used to see how much resistance the different gadgets have. So you can see in the picture there's several different gadgets, and the task would be to use all of them and see how they change the power you need to use for using the crank. All the stations are accompanied by the app made by Ovos. So that would be the middle row here with the colorful icons. As you can see, there's only 5, although there are 6 stations. That's because the last patch, the yellow one, comprises of both stations that deal with energy. So the energy experiments of the candy grabber and the measurement station are both behind the yellow patch here. So this is what Ovos and the Butz came up with, and my task was to research the impact those stations have on interest, motivation, and self-efficacy on young learners. So let me take you through my theoretical background next. I was looking at theories about motivation, self-efficacy, and interest, especially regarding STEM. Firstly, I was looking at theories on motivation. So generally, motivation influences behavior, also learning behavior, and there are a lot of different motivational theories regarding learning. I picked out a few examples here. The goal orientation in the goal orientation theory refers to the learner's goals and how they orient themselves to achieve them. There is a difference between performance goals, which would mean I want to perform better than my peers, or mastery goals, which would mean the learner has a goal to be really good at something and will orient themselves to achieve the specific skills. The expectancy value theory, in contrast, tries to understand how choices are made, and it postulates the choices are made by people and their expectations of success on the one hand, and the value this success has on the other. The self-determination theory distinguishes between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and it also postulates that every human has psychological needs that would mean to be autonomous, to be competent, and to have relatedness to the task at hand. Please note that this is a very short introduction to those theories, and if you're interested, I would really advise you to read more on them. They are rather more complex than I'm explaining here. Also, there are a lot of more theories of motivation in general. This is just to give a quick overview of a few I chose. However, there is many more. What I found helpful is meta-literature that tries to compare different motivational theories and what they have in common. And one thing that they have in common is that motivation comes from a perception and beliefs in one's own competence, as well as appraisal and expectation of a value, as well as interwovenness of internal and external factors. So although the theories are very different, there are some things that they have in common, and this is what I tried to use. In Austria, there's also additional guidelines for education, and they speak of a motivational competence that can be learned and facilitated. Thus, in an Austrian guideline book, motivation itself is called a competence. And although this is not common in the meta-cognition of motivational theories, I found it interesting to view it that way, especially for this project. So how was motivation viewed in this particular research context? I tried to define motivation rather broadly so that I wouldn't miss any aspects of it in my later collection of data. So, motivation is a person's characteristic or trait, but it's also a state in which one can be, and it's also a human function that controls behavior. It was further considered a competence that can be learned and facilitated, and a result of estimating and weighing a value or the probability of success. And closely related with that, motivation is also comprised of the belief in oneself or something. Motivation in STEM is considered to influence the active participation, thus taking on different STEM tasks. Motivation in STEM also means that someone will do a task for longer or more extensively, which can further lead to the acquisition of more knowledge and skills in STEM. And motivation in STEM has been researched to increase a student's motivations and aspirations to develop a career in STEM. Closely related to motivation and also interconnected in some parts are the theories about self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the human belief in their own capabilities to produce a desired effect by taking action. Believing in one's own skills and capabilities is usually related to a specific domain or activity and does not necessarily have to correlate with the actual competences. One can just believe one is good at and maybe isn't that good at all. But that works the other way around too. Maybe someone doesn't believe in their skills but actually has a lot of them. Self-efficacy can be influenced and or learned, due to the literature, by having different experiences. Mastery experiences would mean experiencing that I am myself mastering something. Thus, I start believing in my own skills. Vicarious experiences would mean that I, as a learner, am observing someone that I can identify with who achieves a difficult task, which makes me more inclined to believe that I can do it too. An experience of social persuasion would mean that one of my peers or superiors tells me that I'm good at something and I believe them, because why would they lie to me? And each of these experiences also has a physiological and emotional component to it. With this strong connection to believing in oneself, I hope it becomes clear how self-efficacy and its theories are connected to motivation. Believing in myself and my skills, on the one hand, of course, indicates high self-efficacy, but on the other hand, it's inclined to motivate me. If you, for example, look at the expectancy value theory, where my expectation of success will steer my behavior and motivation. This connection can also be seen when looking at literature that researches self-efficacy and its relation to STEM. It has been researched that self-efficacy is seen as an influencing factor for motivation in STEM and also as an indicator of performance. While this may seem contrary because the belief doesn't necessarily correlate with competences, it still has an important influence on the performance. That is because people with higher self-efficacy are more motivated to deal with STEM for a very long amount of time and then actually will get better. And also people with higher self-efficacy seek out more different tasks, which also improves their skills in STEM. This indicates an upward spiral that if you already believe in your STEM capabilities, the feeling of self-efficacy in STEM will rise even further. So, educational STEM interventions should try to increase self-efficacy in the first place, that the upward spiral can start. It can do that by creating mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, or trigger social persuasion in groups. Last but not least, let's look at theories about interest. Interest consists of different components that are cognitive, emotional, and affective. Interest in something can also trigger the joy of learning. But the joy of learning can also come from something other than interest. Generally, there is a differentiation between situational interest and individual interest. Situated interest is the affective reaction to something, thus the immediate reaction that I feel, and it can be influenced by novelty, autonomy, excitement, and social relatedness, for example, of a new task or a new gadget. The individual interest is the intrinsic wish or tendency of a person to do a certain activity or perform a certain task. It can arise, for example, through prolonged situational interest. The literature shows that STEM interest can be promoted in schools and that promoting STEM interest influences the career choices of children and young persons. With the theoretical background of motivation, self-efficacy, and interest in mind, let's move on to the research design. I tried to examine the educational experiences of the participants in regard to the station and their motivational, self-efficacy, and interest impact. As motivation, interest, and self-efficacy are personal experiences that are born from one's own perception, I wanted to capture this in my research. Thus, instead of measuring or trying to put numeric values to those concepts, my attempt was made to depict the experiences in its complexity and nuances. So I conducted a qualitative study to understand the immediate effect of the stations and include the perspectives of the participants. This was a practice-based research based on using the stations. Please note that this research speaks of the learning stations themselves as artifacts and can't make a case beyond that. So my research questions were: what short-term effects do interactive STEM learning stations have on the youth's interest, motivation, and self-efficacy regarding STEM topics? And how do young people describe their experiences with the STEM learning stations? So to conduct this research, first plans were made in November 24, where the proposal and preparations were made. The data collection and preparation of data happened in the early 2025 to mid-25. And then the corpus was defined and the analyzation with Max QDA and the thematic analysis happened in the third quarter of 25. After that, there was a report and a dissemination, which ends with today. Let me briefly tell you about the data collection. So firstly, prior to working with the stations, it was supposed to be a self-assessment scale and a group discussion to talk about motivation, interest, and self-efficacy in general and how the group feels. During the stations, there would be observations and the writing of protocols. And after the stations, there would be another self-assessment scale and a group discussion and post-it comments where the participants were asked to how they would like to improve the stations. The scales and the discussions were meant to make visible and explicit a difference in the motivation, interest, and self-efficacy, to maybe see how the stations really influenced it and what other factors would come into play. However, the original plan was changed a bit. Firstly, the stations were originally designed for children 10 to 14 years old in school. The research was also meant to take place in schools, and it was supposed to be 3 to 4 classes with children. However, it was not possible to organize dates in schools, and the teachers did not consent to the research. Further, the parents did not consent either, and it couldn't be done this way. Thus, the data was collected from older youth, apart from school, that were in career orientation programs. This could be organized by the BUTS. Secondly, the self-assessment scale was supposed to be within the app. However, in practice, the participants did not use their own devices with the app. They actually had tablets that were provided by the BUTS, and they worked in teams. And if not every single person could fill out the scale, it wouldn't make sense to use them this way. So the plan was switched from the self-assessment within the app to an analog self-assessment with posters and sticker dots. Let me summarize the specifics of this data corpus. So there was one date of data collection. I was able to work with 2 groups in some 31 participants, which resulted in having 6 posters, 2 observational protocols, and 3 audio recordings and their transcripts. There's also 105 post-it comments. All of this was analyzed with a thematic analysis by Brown and Clark with Max QDA to get a holistic view of the various sets of data. The thematic analysis allows for diversity and a nuanced understanding of different concepts, and it allows individual experiences and situations to be looked at. It's also context sensitive in its understanding. In the thematic analysis, themes and sub-themes are found by the researcher. The presentations of the findings that I will show in a minute will orient itself along the themes and sub-themes I found. Arguably, this research, with its change in data collection, has its limitations. Firstly, the target group for the learning stations are younger children. As I said, the stations were designed for kids 10 to 14 years old. The data of this research was collected from a different age group, and the stations were designed with children in mind, not teenagers. The participants of this research, however, are older, and instead of school, they are in career orientation programs. That means they are further advanced in the educational journey than the younger children, but they also have other needs and problems. They are not the target group for the learning stations in the first place. However, this group has more educational experiences than the younger children and can evaluate the stations in a different context to their prior learning. As they are older, they may have different abilities to communicate verbally what they think about the stations and criticize them, maybe better than the younger ones would. So, this data was deemed valuable to answer the research questions of the practice-based research. Another limitation of this research is that it can only look at short-term effects of the learning stations. The altered setting, researching in school versus apart from school, could also have influenced the data that was collected. It is possible that once the service of these stations is established better in Burgenland, the research can be conducted in other settings as well in the future. Let us have a look at the findings next. I will start with the self-assessment scales for motivation, interest, and self-efficacy, and then move onwards to the observational protocols as well as the group discussions. So this is the self-assessment scale for motivation. As you can see, red was the dots they placed before and green after. And you see this twice because there were two groups. So the left one is the first group and the right one is the second group. The first group on the left side is spread out more evenly prior to the stations than the second group on the right. And as you can see, for the left group, the red dots from before shifted somewhat upwards and after the working with the stations. The second group, the one on the right side, was generally more motivated before the conduction of the stations than the first group. So you can see that by the red dots indicating the funny smiley. However, they also moved upwards, like all of them, to the starry-eyed smiley. I put on all the dot votes also into this diagram to maybe make it visible in another way as well. As you can see, there is a shift towards a positive tendency. So we can assume that they were more motivated after they worked with the stations than they were before. The placement of the sticker votes was also discussed with them, as well as asking them how and why they placed them higher up than before or even lower than before. You'll see that in a bit. Let us move on to the self-assessment scale for self-efficacy. As you can see, the red dots they placed before working with the stations, the green ones after. Group 1 is on the left, Group 2 is on the right. And once again, the first group on the left side is spread rather evenly and did not feel very self-efficacious, but then moved somewhat upwards. And the second group was once again not spread as evenly and also moved upwards. Please note that in neither group, prior to the stations, there was any person feeling very high in self-efficacy. So no red dots at the highest point of the scale before, but several after, especially in the second group. Please also note that in the second group, no one felt very low in self-efficacy prior to working with the stations, but one of the green dots moved even lower. And I was talking to the participant who placed the dot, and you'll see that in a bit. So self-efficacy even decreased for one person. That's also visible in the diagram with a tiny green dot for the second group after working with the stations. The self-assessment scale for interest looks like this. Once again, the red dots were placed before working with the stations, the green ones afterwards. Group 1, the leftmost group, was not very interested, let's say mediocrely interested, and after working with the stations, they expressed more interest. They did so by putting the dots on the scales, but also within the group discussion. The second group also shows this upward trend with being mediocrely interested in Mint before working with the stations and then being put up slightly upward. Once again, there is one green dot very far to the right. You can see that with the angry smiley. So interest even decreased because they were very annoyed. So tendencies are from being mediocrely interested to being more interested, with a few exceptions. I'll move on to the observations and group interviews. So they happen in the context of the self-assessment scale and talking about them too, the group interviews that is. And the next few slides are separated into the themes that I found with the thematic analysis. So each of them now being a theme with a few intermezzos that I will talk about shortly. So one thing that could be observed, but also was discussed in the group discussions, was their reading behavior. Usually when they arrived at the station, they first needed to try the new gadgets and just dive right in, and they did not read at first, and sometimes not at all. Sometimes with this explorative approach, they would hit a dead end and then had to read how to continue with the stations. However, they said that they were so eager to start working with the devices right away that if they had to read something, that would dampen down their motivation. Also seeing here this quote, if you're really interested by something, you don't want to sit down and read first, you just want to start away. So that indicates that reading would dampen their motivation. However, starting to work with the gadgets right away could also mean that they feel high in self-efficacy because they don't need to read and they're confident they can work with them anyway. Also, it turned out that the gadgets were novel to them. And considering the theoretical background of all of this, novelty can influence interest. So there might be an indicator for that as well. The next theme, being motivation, arose from the observations on one hand, and the group interviews on the other. So some of that was explicitly deemed as motivation and some was interpreted as motivation. So firstly, participants tried often to do things off the script. So not what was said they should do with the stations, but inventing new exercises or adding to exercises or coming up with new things. They also posted that on the posted comments where they came up with new things to do or stuff they would wish for. The social aspects of the stations was deemed very motivating. So there was laughter, there was cheering on each other, they were prompting others to do something, they also asked for help and they seemed to enjoy helping each other out and compliment on each other's strengths. So they build on top of each other's knowledge as well. So all in all, it was a very funny and doing hands-on atmosphere. Some of the participants were observed and then asked about challenging themselves. So they wanted to be particularly good at something and they really wanted to stick out with what they could do at something or even experiment whether they could. And notably, the participants also connected whatever they were doing to their own life world. An example is the AI station, where they tried to come up with pictures of their boyfriends, so connecting it to what they were interested in, or some kind of a party station, so they turned the measurement station with the blinking lights into a party station where they started filming themselves, indicating once again doing things off the script, but also being motivated to reinvent themselves. And as mentioned before, the novelty of the devices and the novelty of the opportunities was explicitly said to be motivating. So this brings me to the first intermezzo. Let me briefly talk about the flow state. I cannot pronounce this researcher's surname, so I will not. The flow state is something that each of you probably has experienced before. It is indicated by a very high level of concentration and total immersion in the activity one is doing, forgetting everything around oneself. It is also embodied by its effortlessness. And to achieve it, there needs to be a fine balance between the challenge at hand and their own skills. During the users of the station, it was often observed that they were very involved in what they were doing and the task of the stations. And there are a few examples where they just did not notice the swapping of the stations. This could indicate a flow state. Of course, we can't be sure, but I would say there are tendencies where they were really absorbed with the stations and working with them. Another theme that could be found in the observations as well as the group interviews was talking about demotivation. So it wasn't all rosy and happiness. And demotivation arose when the participants didn't understand the task of the station, which could come from not reading or sometimes just being not put in a way that they'd understand. Sometimes they did not like how the station presented itself. They deemed the Dash robot, for example, too childish, which can arise from, being that the station was designed for younger children. And sometimes they found the task or the station itself boring or too difficult, so that also caused demotivations. I put a quote here where a participant is very unhappy with the station itself because it was an AI station and how it presented, because the task was to create a desired image. And they were really unhappy because they didn't have a desired image, they didn't want to do it, and they are bad at explaining. So expressing demotivation all over the place. Let me quickly introduce you to the theme of the group size and how that influenced motivation, interest, and self-efficacy. So the group size in the first group was 2 to 3 participants, and it depended on the ratio of provided tablets versus number of participants. So if there were more participants, they had to be in bigger groups. However, in 2-person groups, there were variable arrangements. They coordinated themselves who did what. There was usually a division of labor as well as skill sharing and building upon each other's strengths when dividing labor. And some groups also invented a context-specific language that is, for example, for the coordinate system where the dash needed to move around in. So they used those skills, and they really showed that they could work together well with 2 persons in a group. However, with 3 persons in a group, the division of labor usually showed as 2 people did the work and 1 became an observant. Some of the tasks were difficult to arrange for a group of 3, so where 2 worked really well, the division of labor by 3 was hardly possible, and the 3rd person usually got bored. A very good example of that is the candy grabber, where 1 person uses the crank to create energy, the other one plays with the grabber, but what does the 3rd one do? And they said that in the group interview too, so at some stations there isn't enough to do for 3 people. And when that was the case, there usually wasn't a lot of motivation either. This brings us to our second little intermezzo, which is the zone of proximal development by Vygotsky. The zone of proximal development is individual for each learner, so it's the zone where they find themselves in. And it's the zone where the next developmental step can be taken. And this zone is reached when the task at hand is a tiny bit above the current skill level. So learners are able to just do it by themselves or with a little bit of help or scaffolding. And when using the stations, the participants often verbally explained their thoughts, for example, when programming or using the drone or when they had to write prompts to their colleagues. And by doing so, they always seemed to boost the whole group by making explicit what they thought. So although the skill levels and thus the zone of proximal development is very different for each of them, mastery experiences could be granted for everyone by making it explicit. Or if not everyone, then at least several people of the group, not only the 1 person who actually stepped upwards the developmental ladder. The next theme that will be discussed is the time and the time management. So for the 2 dates where I could gather data, the time management was done by coaches from the booths. And it was important that there is enough time to get oriented at each station and understand the task to do, but then also do the tasks and, in the best case, find immersion in the tasks that were to do. And too much time wasn't good because then a station would get boring and concentration is lost. But too little time also didn't work well because flow state wasn't possible and the participants had to end in the middle of the exercise and resetting the station wasn't possible anymore. However, the stations needed different amounts of time to finish, so getting the time right in order to help with motivation, interest, and self-efficacy is very tricky. The next theme I named self-efficacy versus insecurity. First and foremost, self-efficacy is deemed motivating, and this is on one hand what it also says in the literature, that self-efficacy is a part of motivation. And on the other hand, the participants themselves said if they felt confident with doing something, they also were more motivated. However, it could be observed during the working with the stations that the participants were often afraid and insecure of breaking something or embarrassing themselves. And sometimes this went hand in hand with thinking that they couldn't do something in the first place. They also were very afraid of making mistakes. But although this could be observed during the observational phase, nobody mentioned this again in the group interview, even after being asked specifically about the insecurities. One striking notion came from the participant that you have seen earlier by the sticker placement, where the self-perception actually made self-efficacy worse. So the individual perception that she said, I simply can't do that, I'm not made for the task, had an even negative effect on self-efficacy. So this participant was the one that placed the sticker lower after working with the stations, if you remember. Last but not least, I wanted to include one of the observations of a youth coach that was on site while I gathered data. And the coach said that the experiences the participants, are making here with working with the stations, they said that they would use them later when they work with the group again in the course that they were having. The coach said that they would later remind the youth about the fun and that they already did something similar, and that will help put their interests into a wider context. So exploring, naming and contextualizing the interest or even need niche interests could help those specific youth that were in job orientation. The coach also assumed that it would take away timidity, for example, when starting to learn programming or working with bigger machines, because they had already done so when working with the stations. This brings us to the second to last point of today's presentation, which is the discussion. So generally speaking, the stations at hand can facilitate a variety of experiences, for example, social persuasion and mastery experiences, which is in turn important to raise self-efficacy. The situated interest was very high due to the novelty and autonomy of the stations, but it was not named as interest, but as a factor for motivation itself. The social aspects as well as connections to the life worlds of the youth were prevalent and deemed important, but as of now they are not utilized in the tasks or the stations themselves. So they just parallelly work positively, but not in a utilized way. Partiality and personal bias is boosted positively and negatively. So if a person goes in already being somewhat motivated or somewhat feeling that the self-efficacy is rather high, then that is boosted, but also it works in the opposite direction. If someone enters not being motivated, not feeling self-efficient, and then probably having prejudice about one's own abilities, that can also be negatively boosted. Generally speaking, the stations could meet the participants at their individual zone of proximal development, especially if they worked in a group. The whole group could be boosted if making explicit what they thought. And participants did not want to read. In fact, the reading itself stands in contrast to the valence of the stations. In German, we have a word that's Aufforderungscharakter. It means an inviting characteristic that you have to do something and touch and start experimenting, and that's in contrast to having to read first. So maybe there needs to be a bit of a redesign on how the stations can be approached. That does not include reading as a first step. To conclude this point, the stations at hand did have an impact on motivation, self-efficacy and interest in the short term. However, those that came into this whole project that were already feeling pretty good about STEM afterwards felt better, and those who didn't feel good in the first place couldn't be helped. So in some way, Burgenland's idea for an educational intervention for STEM did work. However, I want to leave this whole presentation with a new perspective that I want to include. At the moment, the stations are very focused on the tasks which are mainly technical, for example, flying with a drone or programming a robot. Success is influenced and measured by technical affinity and capability. So those who do not have a high affinity or don't feel capable do not feel seen or met in their needs. However, success in STEM is more than being able to steer machines. Skills that are needed for STEM are also planning, organization, orientation, working in the group, dividing labor, understanding and defining processes, also creativity, communication and problem solving. All of that is important for STEM and maybe can be met by the stations. So my suggestions for this and similar interventions that try to focus on STEM would be to make other skills and competences meaningful and visible, and also include them in measuring the success in STEM in general. With a few tweaks, it should be possible to create mastery experiences and positive attitudes towards other future skills that are needed for STEM. That was it from me and my presentation. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. So please enjoy the rest of the Site Conference 2026, and I hope to get in touch with some of you soon.